He was the heir to a quarter of the world, and for 59 years, the only thing anybody permitted him to do was enjoy himself. To the great houses of late Victorian England, he was simply the prince, a heavy, genial, beautifully dressed man with a cigar and a laugh you could hear through a closed door, who arrived for the shooting on a Friday with a valet and 40 pieces of luggage, ate 5 meals a day, and won or lost a small fortune at cards before Monday. To the newspapers, he was a scandal that could not yet be printed. To Paris, he was adoringly Le Prince de Galles. And to his own mother, the Queen, he was something else entirely. He was the man who had killed her husband. That is the legend. And, like most legends about this family, it is not exactly a lie, and it is nowhere near the truth. Behind the cigars and the racehorses stood a boy, broken on the wheel of the most ambitious education ever designed for an English prince. Behind that stood a young man who committed one entirely ordinary indiscretion in an army camp in Ireland, and was punished for it, without pause and without pardon, for the next 40 years. There was a wife who watched a procession of other women pass through her husband's life and never said one word about any of them in public. There were 2 courtrooms 21 years apart, in which a future King of England stood and answered questions on oath. There was a boy on a railway platform in Brussels with a revolver. And at the very end, there was a surprise nobody in England had thought possible. This is not the story of the king on the coins. It is the story of what 60 years of waiting does to a man. And it begins with a father who set out to build a perfect king and got a child instead. He was born at Buckingham Palace on the 9th of November 1841, at 48 minutes past 10 in the morning, and within the hour, the guns in the park were telling London what the bulletins had not yet had time to print. A boy. The Queen had been safely delivered of a son. After a long century of mad kings and dissolute regents, after a succession that had come within a whisker of failing altogether, the throne had an heir who was healthy, legitimate, and male, and a nation that had learned to expect very little from its royal family allowed itself, for one November morning, to be delighted. They christened him Albert Edward, his father's name coming first, because his father's name was rather the point of him. He was created Prince of Wales before he was a month old, on the 8th of December 1841, a title laid upon an infant who could not yet hold up his own head, and which he would go on to hold for 59 years and 45 days. No heir in the history of the English crown has ever waited longer. The longest apprenticeship in British history began while its subject was still in his cradle, and almost immediately his father began to make plans. Prince Albert was, by any honest reckoning, a remarkable man, serious, tireless, intellectually voracious, and quietly certain that the monarchy could survive the coming century only by making itself morally unassailable. He had watched his wife's uncles drink and gamble and scatter illegitimate children across half of London, and from that spectacle he had drawn a conclusion that was perfectly logical and almost entirely wrong. The character of a king, Albert believed, could be engineered. Given the correct curriculum, the correct supervision, and the correct removal of every temptation, a boy could be built into a philosopher on a throne. Great. So he sat down with Baron Stockmar, the shrewd, cold German physician who had guided his own upbringing and served both Victoria and Albert as something between a mentor and a conscience, and together the 2 men designed a system of education for a child who was, at the time, 7 years old. It was extraordinary. 6 days a week, timetabled hour by hour, from the morning until the light went. Latin and German and French, mathematics, history, geography, chemistry, religion, drawing, music, riding, gymnastics. Written reports submitted to his father, who read them all. Companions were not made, but appointed. A small selection of carefully vetted boys admitted like specimens into a laboratory. Ordinary schoolboys were kept at a distance in case they carried the infection of ordinary schoolboy life. There were no holidays, in any sense his contemporaries would have recognized. There was, above all, no idleness. Because idleness, in Albert's careful theology, was where kings went wrong. The machine was built with immense care, and it broke almost at once on the child inside it. His first serious tutor, Henry Burge, an Eton master of real gentleness, found his pupil close to unteachable. Not slow exactly, but restless, hot-tempered, and impossible to hold to a page. The boy raged, he threw things. He hurled himself on the floor in fits of temper that frightened the household and were dutifully recorded in the reports going upstairs. And yet when Birch was moved on in 1852, too gentle, it was decided, too soft on the boy, his biographers record that the prince was heartbroken and hid little presents about the schoolroom for a man he had spent 3 years defying. The two remained friends for the rest of Birch's life. It tells you rather more about the child than any of the reports do. Birch's successor, Frederick Weymouth Gibbs, was a barrister with no gift for children whatsoever, and his diaries of the next 6 years read like a dispatch from a small, exhausting war. Screaming, sullen silences. Books thrown across rooms. A boy fighting, day after day a battle. He could not name against expectations. He could not meet. At one point his parents engaged a phrenologist to examine the shape of his skull, and were told, with all the authority of a science that no longer exists, that the prince suffered from strong self-will and, at times, obstinacy. But it did not seem to occur to anyone that a child under total surveillance, being graded daily against a standard of perfection, might simply have been miserable. He was not stupid. That charge, repeated for the rest of his life, was never true. He had a quick, exact memory for people and places, an excellent ear for languages, and a grasp of ceremony and precedent that professional courtiers would later find slightly unnerving. What he did not have, what he was never going to have, however many hours were timetabled, was the abstract, bookish, wholly interior cast of mind that his father possessed and revered. And he had a sister, Victoria. Vicky, the Princess Royal, 11 months his elder, was everything the plan had hoped for and had not needed to produce. She was brilliant. She read voraciously, argued with her father as an equal before she was 15, and moved through the same curriculum that was crushing her brother, as though it were a gentle amusement. Albert adored her. He made no particular secret of it. So Bertie grew up in the position that ruins children in every class and every century. He was the second draft of somebody else, and everybody in the house had read the first. There was one thing he could do that neither of them could. He was warm, he was funny and interested, and entirely without side. He remembered the names of servants and the illnesses of their mothers. He could enter a room of strangers and, within about 90 seconds, have 3 of them talking easily about themselves, a skill so natural to him that he never seems to have realized it was a skill at all. In the household of Prince Albert, this counted for exactly nothing. It was not on the timetable, it could not be graded. It looked from the study window like frivolity. The regime tightened as he grew. He was sent to Edinburgh in the summer of 1859 to study under the chemist Lyon Playfair, then to Christ Church, Oxford, that October, and on to Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1861, where Charles Kingsley taught him history. At none of these places was he permitted to live as a student. He was lodged apart in private houses with an equerry and a governor, forbidden the ordinary companionship of his own generation, and marched to lectures like a prisoner permitted a view of the yard. And then, in the summer of 1860, they let him out. And something happened that nobody in his family knew how to interpret. He was sent across the Atlantic on a 4-month tour of Canada and the United States, the first ever undertaken by a Prince of Wales. He was 18. He opened the Victoria Bridge at Montreal and laid the cornerstone of the Parliament buildings at Ottawa. He stood in the spray at Niagara and watched Blondin cross the falls on a rope. He went to Washington and spent 3 days at the White House as the guest of President Buchanan, met Longfellow and Emerson, and drew crowds in New York so vast that the police lost control of the streets. He was a triumph. Not a competent performance of a duty, a genuine, roaring, transatlantic triumph, achieved by a boy who had been told for 11 years that he was a disappointment, and achieved by doing the one thing he had never been taught, being like. He came home to Windsor in the autumn of 1860. His father read the reports, noted some deficiencies of deportment, and returned him to his studies. Nothing had changed at all. To Albert, he was still an idle boy, in need of correction. To Victoria, he was still a disappointment in a good coat. And so, in the summer of 1861, his parents devised one more experiment upon their son. 10 weeks in an army camp on a great open plain in Ireland, where hard soldiering and hard discipline might, at last, make a man of him. He arrived at the Curragh in the last warm days of an Irish summer. Within a fortnight, his brother officers, delighted with their shy and eager royal guest, had smuggled a young woman into his quarters as a joke. And the consequences of those few nights would fall on him, without mercy, for the next 40 years. The Curragh is a plain in County Kildare, thousands of acres of open turf and gorse, flat and treeless, where for centuries the Irish had raced horses and the army had drilled men. In the 1852nd, the War Office built a camp on it, 10,000 soldiers, in numbered ranks of wooden huts. In the evenings there was very little to do. To Prince Albert it must have looked close to perfect. The scheme was his, and characteristic in every particular. Precise, well-meant, very slightly inhuman. His son would be attached to the Grenadier Guards for 10 weeks and advanced through the ranks a fortnight at a time, as though soldiering were another syllabus, and at the end of it, with his parents watching, he would take a battalion onto the field and command it. An examination, in other words, with an empire in the audience. He arrived willing. He liked the army, and for the first time he was among young men of his own age who had not been appointed to him. But he was slow at drill, and a battalion moves on nothing but words of command. His commanding officer is said to have told him, kindly enough, that he was too imperfect in his drill to be trusted with one in front of the Queen. So on the day of the review, the Prince of Wales marched past at the head of a single company. 100 men. 90 seconds. Another small, immaculately documented failure for the file. And in the evenings, as has been said, there was very little to do. His brother officers were fond of him, which explains what followed, better than any theory of corruption does. They found their royal guest shy, eager, and comically inexperienced, and that summer they decided to complete an education his father had left conspicuously unfinished. A young woman was brought into the camp and into his quarters. Her name was Nellie Clifton. Almost nothing else about her can be stated with confidence. She was young. She was described in the language of the day as an actress, a word which in 1861 often meant only that a woman was poor, unmarried, and known to men. No reliable portrait survives, no reliable date of birth, nothing whatever in her own words. What is known is that she was procured for a 19-year-old prince as a joke among officers, that the affair ran to a handful of knights, though how many has never been established. The number that fastened itself to the story was 10, and that she died young and poor, unassisted by anybody who had once found her useful. Of the 2 people in that hut, only one had an empire arranged around the protection of his name. 3 weeks after he left Ireland, on the 24th of September 1861, he was introduced to a Danish princess in the cathedral at Speyer. Her name was Alexandra. His father had spent that year drawing up a list of the eligible Protestant princesses of Europe, and had placed her at the top of it. She was 16, and she was, in Albert's mind, the beginning of the solution. By then, the story from the Curragh was already travelling. Soldiers talk, so above everything does London. Within weeks the thing had crossed from a camp in Kildare to the smoking rooms of Pall Mall, where it was repeated as the joke of the season, and from there, by one well-attested route, through the son of Baron Stockmar, to Windsor. Prince Albert learned of it in November 1861. He was in no condition to hear it. He was 42 and had been unwell for close to 2 years. Abdominal pain, cramping, sleeplessness, a slow erosion of appetite and of weight that his physicians examined and failed entirely to explain. He went on working as though none of it were happening. Into the middle of that arrived the news that his heir had been sleeping with an actress in an army camp, and that half of London had known before he did. He wrote to his son almost at once. Several accounts date the letter to the 16th of November. It was less a rebuke than a lament, written at a pitch of anguish that has startled biographers ever since. Albert wrote that the business had caused him the deepest pain he had yet felt in his life, and he set out what he believed would follow, that the young woman would bear a child, or claim to, that she would be put into a witness box and made to swear to the details in open court, before a jury and a room full of reporters, and that his son would stand in that same court, unable to deny a word of it. Writing was not enough. On the 25th of November, unwell and exhausted, Albert travelled to Cambridge to confront the boy in person. They dined at Madingley Hall, and afterwards they went out and walked. It was late November in the Fens. The weather was cold and wet, and at some point they lost their way in the fields beyond the village, and walked a great deal further than either had intended. What was said between them out there has never been reliably recorded. What is known is its shape. Bertie confessed, and his father forgave him entirely, and wrote afterwards, with relief, that the boy's contrition had been sincere. They parted on good terms. It was the last time they saw one another in health, and the quarrel was over. Whatever his mother would afterwards believe, Prince Albert died, with nothing unresolved between himself and his eldest son. He returned to Windsor and never recovered. He could not sleep or eat, and wandered from room to room, unable to settle. His doctors, led by Sir William Jenner, gave the illness a name in the first days of December, typhoid fever, and went on assuring the Queen, almost to the end, that there was no cause for alarm. On the 13th, Princess Alice, 18 years old, and the only realist in that household, sent for her brother without telling her mother. Bertie travelled through the night from Cambridge, and reached Windsor in the small hours of the 14th. Prince Albert died at 10 minutes to 11 that night, in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, his wife and 5 of his children about the bed. He was 42 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever. Modern medicine has never been comfortable with it. Typhoid is an acute infection. It arrives, it burns, and it resolves. One way or another, within weeks. It does not spend 2 years hollowing a man out. The record of Albert's final years, the recurring abdominal pain, the wasting, the partial recoveries, followed by relapse, reads to modern physicians like the arc of a chronic disease, and the candidates most often proposed are Crohn's disease and an abdominal cancer. No diagnosis made a century and a half after the fact can be certain, and the argument continues. But on one point the modern consensus does not divide, and everything that follows depends upon it. Whatever killed Prince Albert had been killing him for a long time before his son ever set foot in Ireland. A scandal does not cause a cancer. A walk in the rain does not cause a disease of the bowel. Bertie did not do this, none of which was of the slightest use. In the hours after her husband's death, a widow of 42 performed a piece of arithmetic. She would never revise. Albert had gone to Cambridge because of Bertie. He had walked in the cold and the wet because of Bertie. He had come home ill, and he had died. 3 facts in the correct order, and it did not matter that the line drawn between them was not a cause but a coincidence, because grief does not check its own working. Grief only wants somewhere to put the weight. The doctors signed the certificate, The bells tolled across a stunned and grieving empire, and a nation began to build the greatest cult of mourning in its history. But inside Windsor Castle, in a room where the clocks would be stopped and the clothes laid out every morning for 40 years, the Queen was not thinking about typhoid. She had already decided who had done this. 3 days after her husband's death, she wrote of her 19-year-old son in words that no child should ever read, and that Bertie, in one form or another, would spend the rest of her long life hearing the letter, went to Prussia. 3 days after Albert died, the Queen wrote to her eldest daughter, Vicky, the clever one, made in her father's image and married into Berlin at 17. The subject was her brother. Bertie was distraught. He had wept at the bedside and had promised to be everything to his mother. Now she did not want it. And then, in the middle of a letter about a grief they shared, she set down the sentence that would hang over the rest of her son's life like weather. "I never can or shall," she wrote, "look at him without a shudder." 11 words. Written to his sister about a 19-year-old boy who had just lost his father, she meant them. That is the part hardest to accommodate. This was not the wild overstatement of a first week of grief, quietly retracted once the shock had passed. She held to it and repeated the substance of it, in letters and in conversation, for decades. She wrote of the Curragh, in the phrase most often reported, as that dreadful business. For months she could hardly bear to be in a room with him, and did not trouble to hide it. She was wrong, not partly wrong, not understandably wrong on a point of interpretation, wrong on the medical facts. The disease that killed Albert had been at work in him for 2 years before any officer of the Grenadier Guards had an idea about how to entertain the Prince of Wales. But a verdict does not require evidence when the judge is also the bereaved. Historians have long noted both the cruelty of it and the convenience. Grief with a name and a face attached is terrible to carry, but it is not the worst thing. The worst is grief with no cause at all, which simply arrives and takes the one person you have arranged your existence around. Victoria could not accept a universe in which Albert had died for nothing. So she found a reason, and the reason was standing in the room, 19 years old, in a black coat, waiting to be forgiven. History would blame a fever. Victoria blamed her son. The first thing she did was get him out of the country. In February 1862, he was dispatched on a 4-month journey to Egypt, the Holy Land, and Constantinople, in the charge of Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, a clergyman of formidable learning. The tour had been Albert's idea, planned before his death. His mother now insisted upon it, in mourning, and without any of the public appearances that might have made it enjoyable. They sailed up the Nile. They rode into Jerusalem. A photographer, Francis Bedford, travelled with them and made the first surviving photographic record of a royal tour. He behaved impeccably, and Stanley reported home that he had been an admirable companion. It made no difference at all. Because there was a second remedy, and the Queen reached for it the moment he was home. Albert had selected Alexandra of Denmark before he died, and Victoria now treated that choice as a testament, an instruction from beyond the grave, not to be questioned by anybody. Beneath the piety was a colder calculation, which she did not trouble to disguise. A wife would settle him. A wife would put an end to the Nellie Clivdens. Marriage, in this reading, was not a happiness to be hoped for on her son's behalf. It was a lock to be fitted to a door. They met again at Laeken, outside Brussels, in the first days of September 1862, under the roof of his great-uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians and the matchmaker of the European royal houses. He proposed on the 9th. She accepted. He was 20. She was 17. He wrote home that he was happy. And the awkward thing, the thing that complicates every tidy account of this marriage, is that he almost certainly was. She had been born on the 1st of December 1844 in the Yellow Palace in Copenhagen. Plain house on a public street, not a palace in any sense the word carries in England. Her father, Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glucksburg, was an army officer with a modest income and a distant claim to the Danish throne. The family were known, without much unkindness, as the poor relations of European royalty. It was said the daughters made their own dresses. Within a year of the wedding, that household would be among the best connected on the continent. Her father crowned King Christian IX, one brother elected King of the Hellenes, another to take the Danish throne in his turn, and her younger sister Dagmar sent to Russia to become the Empress Marie Feodorovna, and in time the mother of its last Tsar. Alexandra herself was 18. She was beautiful, in a way the photographs of the period still transmit. She was also warm, funny, obstinate, entirely unbookish, devoted to animals and to children, and so chronically unpunctual that the household eventually organized itself around her lateness. There was one thing about her that England was not told. She had inherited from her mother a condition called otosclerosis, a hardening in the small bones of the middle ear, and at 18 he was already a little deaf. It would deepen every year for the rest of her life, and it would end by walling her into silence inside the noisiest household in Europe. They were married on the 10th of March 1863 in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and it was the strangest royal wedding of the century. Not Westminster Abbey, in front of the nation, but a chapel inside a castle, because the Queen would not permit London. The court was still in mourning, 15 months after Albert's death, and the mourning was not suspended for a wedding. The ladies were instructed into grey and lilac and mauve, so that a marriage was solemnized before a congregation dressed for a funeral, and the mother of the bridegroom would not sit among them. Victoria watched the marriage of her heir from Catherine of Aragon's closet, a small stone gallery set high above the chancel, alone, in black, looking down. When William Powell Frith painted the scene, he put her up there in her corner, and every eye that rests on the picture goes to her first. The day before, she had taken the couple down to the mausoleum at Frogmore, stood them in front of her husband's tomb, joined their hands, and, she is said to have told them, given them his blessing. The country, meanwhile, had lost its head entirely. Alexandra's progress into London on the 7th of March drew crowds so vast that the arrangements collapsed and people were injured in the crush. Tennyson wrote an ode of welcome to the Sea King's daughter from over the sea. After 10 years of an invisible court and a queen in permanent black, the nation had been handed a young, handsome, visibly happy couple, and it responded with an enthusiasm that startled everybody. The Queen did not go down to the wedding breakfast. She dined alone, and then the arrangements were made for the rest of his life. They were given Marlborough House beside St. James's Palace, and Sandringham, an unremarkable estate in Norfolk bought for the prince the year before. They were given an income voted by Parliament, a household, a stable, a yacht, and a diary. What they were not given was a job. The shape of this matters because it explains everything that follows. The Prince of Wales was not exiled, and he was not disgraced. He was handed a position with no content in it. He was to lay foundation stones, open hospitals, review troops he did not command, and represent the crown at funerals in countries where nothing whatever was at stake. He was not to see state papers. The Queen had concluded, and would go on saying, for the next 4 decades, that her son's character made him unfit to be trusted with anything that mattered, and she built that conclusion into the architecture of his adult life like a load-bearing wall. The circularity seems never to have occurred to her. He was denied serious work because he was frivolous. He became more frivolous because he was denied serious work. And beside him, in that immense, brilliantly lit, entirely purposeless life, stood a girl of 18 who was slowly going deaf, and who had just accepted the position she would hold without a single public complaint for the next 47 years. The country believed it had watched a rescue. The gloom of the widowed Queen was over. A golden couple had been installed at Marlborough House, and the monarchy had a future again. But the Prince of Wales had been handed a life with a shape that would have driven a duller man mad. He was the heir to a quarter of the world, and he was permitted to open bridges. He asked his mother for work for a post, a regiment, a role in the government of the country he would one day rule, and for the next 39 years, the answer would always be no. He was 21 years old. He had been given a wife, a house in London, an estate in Norfolk, an income voted by Parliament, and a diary of engagements stretching out in front of him like a corridor with no door at the end of it. What he had not been given was anything whatever to do. The marriage had taken place on the 10th of March 1863 in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The bridegroom 21, the bride 18, the congregation in grey and lilac, because the court would not come out of mourning, not even for a wedding. Alexandra of Denmark had crossed the North Sea a few days earlier into a welcome that astonished those who saw it. Crowds packed along the whole road from the coast to the capital in an almost hysterical outpouring of relief from a country that had spent 15 months staring at a black-draped throne. She was already beginning to go deaf. They were installed at Marlborough House, brick mansion off Pall Mall, a few minutes' walk across the park from the Queen's own front door, near enough for supervision, far enough for a life of their own. And at Sandringham, a flat, wet, unfashionable Norfolk estate bought for the Prince the year before. Victoria had intended all of it as a settlement, in both senses of the word. A wife would steady him, a household would occupy him, a shooting estate 100 miles from London would keep him clear of the trouble he had found in Ireland. What she had actually built was a stage, because the one thing she would not give him was work. He asked for it. That is the detail most often left out of the story of Edward the Playboy, and it is the one that makes the rest of it comprehensible. He asked and went on asking for the better part of 4 decades. He asked for a Department of State. He asked for a governorship, a diplomatic posting, a real command in the army, rather than the ornamental ranks that arrived on his birthdays. And the answer, from the 1,860 seconds to the very end, was no. Always politely, always finally, and always for the same stated reason. His character could not be trusted with anything that mattered. Nowhere was that verdict written more plainly than in the matter of the boxes. In a Victorian government, the real business of the state travelled in boxes, wooden, covered in scarlet leather, lined and fitted with a lock. They went out from Whitehall every day to wherever the sovereign was, and came back the next morning. Inside were cabinet minutes and ambassadors' telegrams, dispatches from India and the Cape draft legislation, the private warnings of ministers, the whole nervous system of a state that governed a quarter of the human race. The sovereign held a key. There was no constitutional reason why the heir to the throne should not have had one too. Victoria refused. What her son received instead were digests, summaries prepared for him by other people, edited, softened, and generally arriving after the decisions inside them had already been taken. He was permitted to know what his mother's governments were doing. He was not permitted to see it. The distinction sounds like a technicality. It was the entire architecture of his adult life. For 30 years the future King of England read his own country's business, the way a schoolboy reads a set text at second hand, after the event with the important pages removed. Gladstone, who became Prime Minister in 1868, and could never afterwards be persuaded that this was sensible, tried repeatedly to break the deadlock. He proposed employments, drafted schemes to give the Prince a genuine public function, and is understood to have passed him papers privately when the official channels stayed shut. The Queen resisted all of it, and she outlasted him. It was not until 1892, the Prince was 50 years old, and had been waiting half a century, that cabinet papers began to reach him as a matter of course. He was 59 before anybody put a key in his hand. The boxes are worth remembering. In the meantime, a man denied a purpose does not simply stop. He finds something else to be, and Albert Edward found it with a completeness that scandalized his mother and delighted everybody else. He became the most conspicuous private individual in Europe. Around Marlborough House there gathered what London soon learned to call the Marlborough House set, a floating, glittering, faintly disreputable court of aristocrats, soldiers, sportsmen, actresses, bankers, and self-made men. That last category is the one that mattered. Financiers, Americans, brewers' sons, and shipowners sat at his table who would not have been received at Windsor in 100 years. His mother regarded this as evidence of ruin. It was, though nobody said so at the time, the first serious modernization the British monarchy had undergone in a generation. His year acquired the shape of a calendar that half of Europe would eventually copy. The London season and Ascot, cows for the yachting and Goodwood for the racing, autumn shooting, the tables at Homburg, winters at Cannes and Biarritz, and always, again and again, Paris, where he moved with a freedom he was never allowed at home, and where he was known with real affection as Le Prince de Galles. At Sandringham he built the world he wanted. Exactly. He pulled the old house about until it suited him, filled it with guests and noise and dogs, and ran the whole estate as an engine for pleasure, most famously by setting every clock half an hour fast, so that the shooting could begin earlier in the winter dark. Sandringham time survived him by a quarter of a century. The dinners ran to a dozen courses. He is said to have got through some 20 cigarettes and 12 cigars a day. He grew heavy, and his friends called him Tum Tum behind his back. He left the bottom button of his waistcoat undone, and well-dressed men across Europe began doing the same without ever knowing why. It reads, "At this distance," like appetite, some of it was, but a great deal of it was arithmetic. The arithmetic of an intelligent man with 16 waking hours a day, and nothing in any of them that could not be cancelled. His wife, meanwhile, was doing the work that nobody counted. Alexandra bore 6 children in 7 years. Albert Victor in 1864, George in 1865, Louise in 1867, Victoria in 1868, Maud in 1869, and in 1871 a last son, Alexander John, who lived a single day. The birth of Louise nearly killed her. She contracted rheumatic fever, lay dangerously ill for weeks, and rose from it with a permanent limp. Whereupon fashionable young women in London, in one of the more grotesque tributes of the century, began imitating her walk. They called it the Alexandra limp. Her hearing, all the while, went on failing. She was the most loved woman in England, and she was being quietly walled up inside a house full of laughter she could no longer follow. And in 1864 there came a wound that never healed. Prussia and Austria invaded Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein and beat it comprehensively. Alexandra's father, newly a king, lost a third of his kingdom in a matter of months. In London, her mother-in-law's sympathies lay frankly with the Germans, and the British royal family divided along a line that would still be visible 50 years later. Alexandra's dislike of Prussia was set in that year, and it never softened by a degree. She passed a great deal of it to her husband. It would shape the way he saw Europe and the way Europe saw him until the day he died. By the end of the decade, London society understood things about the Prince of Wales that the wider public did not. His evenings were his own. There was an arrangement, unwritten, universally observed, and perfectly stable, and it worked for precisely as long as everybody kept to it. It was, on the surface, an enviable life. The best table, the best shooting, the best company in Europe, and no responsibilities whatever. But a man with nothing to do and everything to spend is a man permanently one step from disaster, and the Prince of Wales had been walking that step for 8 years. In the winter of 1869, a baronet named Sir Charles Mordaunt came home unexpectedly to his house in Warwickshire, found his young wife entertaining a visitor, and afterwards forced open her writing desk. Inside were letters. Some of them were signed by the heir to the throne. Sir Charles Mordaunt was a Warwickshire baronet, a member of Parliament, and a sportsman of the type the mid-Victorian shires produced in quantity, hard riding, hard shooting, and not, by any account that survives, an imaginative man. In 1866 he married Harriet Sarah Moncrieff, a Scottish baronet's daughter, from a large and much admired family of sisters, all of them at ease in exactly the world the Prince of Wales had built around Marlborough House. She was very young. She was placed, without preparation of any kind, in a great, cold country house, among people who lived by rules that were never written down and never explained. In 1869 she gave birth to a daughter, and the child was gravely ill. What happened to Harriet Mordaunt in the weeks that followed was described at the time as a moral collapse. It is not what a doctor would call it now. Feverish, sleepless. Terrified for a baby who might not live, she began to talk to her husband at length, without prompting and without pause. And what she talked about was her own guilt. She named men. She confessed to adulteries in a rush of detail, one after another, in the manner of somebody emptying herself of a burden she could no longer carry alone. Among the names she gave was that of the Prince of Wales. Read from this distance, the confessions have the unmistakable shape of a severe postnatal illness, a condition the 19th century barely understood and had no way of treating, and which it dealt with, when it dealt with it at all, by locking the sufferer away. Whether anything she said was true has never been established. It is not clear that she herself knew. Her husband did not hear an illness. He heard a wife. He broke open her writing desk, and inside it he found letters. Some of them were from the Prince of Wales, and they are, to a modern eye, almost aggressively innocent. A valentine remarks about the weather, chatter about the theatre, and about a pony. There is nothing in them that could not have been read aloud in a drawing-room, and in due course a good deal of it was read aloud in a courtroom. It made no difference whatever. What mattered was the signature. Sir Charles filed for divorce. It is worth pausing on what that meant in 1870. Divorce had been available through the courts for only 13 years, and it was still a public spectacle, an open court, jury, counsel, and reporters, copying down every word for newspapers that sold in tens of thousands on the strength of exactly this kind of story. The Mordaunt case handed the British press something it had never had before: the name of the heir to the throne, inside a matrimonial suit, in print lawfully. Harriet's own family understood at once what was coming, and they defended her in the only way the age allowed. They declared her insane. It is a grim thing to look at directly. To save a young woman from ruin, the people who loved her went into court to prove that her mind had gone, that her confessions were the ravings of a diseased brain, and that she was not fit to plead in her own defense. Doctors testified to what they called puerperal insanity. Sir Charles's side maintained that she was shamming, that the madness had been manufactured to shut the case down, and that a sane woman was being buried to protect a great many reputations. The proceedings opened before Lord Penzance on the 23rd of February 1870, and the newspapers printed them day by day. And then the Prince of Wales was called. Could have resisted it, and there was argument at the time over whether he should. He went. Hey, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, walked into the witness box of a divorce court and took the oath. The first Prince of Wales ever to give evidence in open court. Nothing in the ceremonial of the English crown had ever contemplated the sight. There was an irony in it that nobody troubled to point out at the time. For 7 years he had asked his mother for an office, a department, a command, a posting, anything at all with work in it, and had been refused every time, on the stated grounds that his character could not be relied upon. The first position of any kind that the heir to the British throne was ever called upon to occupy in public was a witness box. The examination lasted about 7 minutes. Lady Mordaunt's counsel took him through the acquaintance, the visits, the letters, the ordinary traffic of society between two families who moved in the same set. That he knew her, and that he had written to her, was never in dispute. Then came the question the entire kingdom had bought its newspapers to read. Had there ever, at any time, been any improper familiarity between himself and Lady Mordaunt? No, never, he said. There was no cross-examination. Counsel for Sir Charles rose, declined to put a single question to him, and sat down. The Prince of Wales left the box, left the court, and went back to his life. No adultery was ever proven against him, not in that courtroom, not by any evidence produced since. The surviving letters are harmless. The only witness who ever said otherwise had been declared, by a court of law, incapable of knowing what she was saying. Everyone else paid. Harriet Mordaunt was found unfit to plead. The findings saved her from the divorce and destroyed everything else. She was taken out of the world as a young woman and never allowed back into it. 36 years in private houses and private asylums, in the care of strangers. While outside the walls, the century turned over, and the man she had named became King of England. She died in 1906, still confined, having spent far more of her life shut away than she was ever permitted to spend free. Sir Charles obtained his divorce in 1875. She's the one unambiguous victim in the whole affair, and, it is worth saying, so plainly she was ill, they called her wicked. When that failed, they called her mad, and locked the door. The prince walked away, except that he did not. Quite. Because the public had watched something it was never meant to see, and it did not care for it at all. Britain in 1870 had been taught for a generation, taught by Albert, taught by Victoria, taught from 10,000 pulpits, that the throne was the guarantor of the nation's private virtue. That was the whole basis of the bargain. And what the country had just seen was a future king standing up in a divorce court to be questioned about another man's wife. Whatever the verdict, the picture could not be unseen. He was hissed at the theatre. When he was booed at a racecourse. The young man who had brought the streets of New York to a standstill 10 years earlier was now jeered in his own capital. There was worse in it than embarrassment. The monarchy at that moment was extraordinarily exposed. The Queen had not been seen in public in any real sense for 8 years. She drew an enormous income and appeared to do nothing for it. Her heir cost the country money and had just been examined on oath about his private life. Cross the Channel, within months, the French would depose an emperor and declare a republic. And in Britain, a question that had been unaskable for a century was beginning very quietly to be asked in public meetings and cheap pamphlets and the back rooms of working men's clubs. The simple, dangerous arithmetical question of what all of this was actually for. He had told the truth, or at least he had not been proven to have told anything else. The court had cleared him. It made no difference whatever. What the country had seen was a future king standing in a divorce court with his hand on a Bible, and it drew its own conclusions. Within 18 months, crowds in Britain's industrial cities were cheering speakers who asked out loud and without embarrassment what exactly the monarchy was for. A member of Parliament stood up in Newcastle and declared himself a Republican. The throne had not looked so unsteady in 100 years. And then, in the last week of November 1871, the Prince of Wales caught a fever, and every calculation in Britain changed. It began with the drains. In the last days of October 1871, the Prince of Wales went north into Yorkshire for a few days' shooting and stayed at Lounsborough Lodge, a house at Scarborough belonging to Lord Lounsborough. It was one of perhaps 40 such visits he made in a year, and there was nothing remarkable about it whatever. What nobody in the party knew, and what would be established only afterwards and at a considerable price, was that the sanitary arrangements of the house were among the worst in England. Modern pipework installed with Victorian enthusiasm and no real understanding of what it was doing, venting the contents of the drains back up into the rooms above. Houses of that kind killed people with a certain regularity all over the country. It simply did not, as a rule, happen to the heir to the throne. He came home to Sandringham in November, feeling unwell, then feverish, then very ill indeed. And on the 23rd of November, his physicians put a name to it in a public bulletin. And the name was the one word calculated to stop the heart of every person in the kingdom old enough to remember the winter of 1861. Typhoid fever. The irony was not lost on anyone. 10 years earlier, the doctors at Windsor had written those same 2 words on a certificate for Prince Albert, a diagnosis modern medicine no longer accepts, and which almost certainly stood in for a chronic disease that had been killing him slowly for 2 years. The father had probably never had typhoid at all. The son, beyond any argument, had it, and he was not the only one. 2 other men who had been inside that house sickened in the same weeks. The 6th Earl of Chesterfield, a fellow guest, died. So did a groom named Charles Blake. One of them was a peer of the realm, and one of them looked after the horses, and the infection made no distinction between them at all, though the newspapers reporting their deaths certainly did. What happened next was one of the strangest episodes in the whole of Victorian public life. For 10 years, this man had been a national embarrassment. He had been hissed in theatres and booed on racecourses. He had stood in a divorce court with his hand on a Bible. In the industrial cities, speakers asked what the monarchy was for, and were cheered for asking. The Queen had not been properly seen in public since her husband died, and a great many people had begun to wonder aloud whether the family was worth what it cost. And then the bulletins went up outside Marlborough House, and the country discovered that it did not want him to die. They came in the rain to read them, clerks, servants, shopkeepers, men off the night shift, standing in the wet, to learn whether the prince's temperature had fallen since the morning. The bulletins were telegraphed to every town in the kingdom and printed in black-edged columns as though the thing had already happened. Churches held services of intercession. In the music halls, audiences got to their feet to sing for his recovery. 10 years of contempt evaporated inside 3 weeks, and it evaporated for a reason that had nothing to do with politics. He was 30 years old, he had a young wife and 5 small children, and he was dying in a house in Norfolk, in the middle of December. He very nearly did. On the 8th of December, he relapsed badly, and after that his life was, in the language of the bulletins, despaired of. The physicians in attendance, Sir William Jenner, who had stood at Prince Albert's bedside 10 years before, with Sir William Gall and Sir James Paget, could do very little beyond nursing him and waiting. Alexandra hardly left the room. And the Queen, who had refused, for a decade, to leave her seclusion for anything the government could devise, came to Sandringham and sat outside her son's door. Then came the date. The crisis broke across the 13th and the 14th of December, 1871, 10 years almost to the hour, from the evening Prince Albert had died in the Blue Room at Windsor. Everybody noticed. The Queen recorded the coincidence in her journal. The newspapers made a great deal of it. From the pulpits, it was preached as something more than coincidence. In a country that had been taught for a decade to think of the 14th of December as the day the good man died, the same date now stood over the son who had been blamed for it, and stood there for 2 nights, and then moved on. On the 16th, the doctors said that he would live. There is one further turn of that particular screw, which nobody in the house could have known. 7 years later, Princess Alice, the daughter who had been in the Blue Room when Albert died, and who came to Sandringham to help nurse her brother, would herself die of diphtheria at Darmstadt on the 14th of December, 1878. The date had begun to look less like a coincidence than a habit for a few weeks that winter. Something else happened that was rarer than the fever. In the sick room, Victoria was tender with her son in a way she had not been since he was a small boy. He was delirious for days, He sang and rambled and talked wildly, and at one point threw a pillow at his mother, and she wrote about it afterwards almost fondly. She stood in the doorway and watched him sleep. There existed, in that fortnight, a version of the future in which the two of them had been handed a second chance and taken it. The country certainly thought so. On the 27th of February 1872, the Queen and the Prince of Wales rode together in an open carriage from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral for a service of national thanksgiving, through streets so densely packed that the procession took hours to pass. Arthur Sullivan wrote a festival Te Deum for the occasion. The Queen, who 3 weeks earlier had gone in person to open Parliament for the first time in years, sat beside her son and was cheered by millions of people for whom the whole thing meant, in effect, that the monarchy had come back to life. The political effect was immediate and total. Sir Charles Dilkeard had stood up in Newcastle in November and declared himself a Republican, and for a few months it had looked as though he might be the beginning of something. On the 19th of March 1872, his Commons motion for an inquiry into the cost of the Crown was crushed. Organised British republicanism, which had been a real force in the industrial towns 18 months earlier, simply collapsed. A fever in a Norfolk bedroom had done what 40 years of speeches could not. And then, having been saved, having been forgiven by an entire nation in the space of a fortnight, he returned to Windsor to find that precisely nothing had changed. He asked again for work. Some post, some department, some share in the business of the country. The answer was what the answer had always been. The Queen's tenderness lasted about as long as his convalescence. By the summer she was writing about his habits again in the old terms, and the doors shut against him in 1862 remained shut in 1872. In a year he was back at the tables, back at the shooting parties, back in Paris, and the private arrangement of his life had resumed at the point where the fever had interrupted it. With one difference. He was, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely and widely loved. And popularity is a very dangerous thing to hand a man who has nothing whatever to do. He had been given back his life and his popularity in the same fortnight, and he had been given them, with a symmetry nobody could miss, on the anniversary of his father's death. It looked, to a sentimental country, like absolution. But absolution requires someone willing to grant it, and the Queen had already gone back to Windsor and back to her verdict. So the Prince of Wales returned to the only life she had ever permitted him, and in the spring of 1877, at a small dinner in London, he arranged to be seated beside a 23-year-old clergyman's daughter from Jersey, who had arrived in society 3 months earlier, with one black dress and no money at all. Within a year, she was the most photographed woman in England, and nothing about how the monarchy conducted its private affairs would ever be quite so private again. The dinner was small, the seating was not an accident. In May of 1877, the Prince of Wales let it be known that he wished to be placed next to a particular young woman at a particular supper party in London, and the arrangement was made, as such arrangements always were, without anybody having to say anything out loud. The young woman was 23 years old. She had been in society for a matter of months. She had arrived from Jersey with a husband she was already tired of, no money to speak of, and one black dress. Her name was Emily Charlotte Le Breton, and the world would know her as Lily Langtry. She had been born on Jersey in October 1853, the daughter of the Dean of the island, raised among brothers, and educated well enough to be bored by everything available to her. At 20, she married Edward Langtry, a widowed yachtsman with a boat and an income that turned out to be a good deal smaller than advertised, largely, by her own later account, because he could take her away. He took her to London. It was not a happy marriage, and it did not become one. They arrived without connections and almost without funds, and she went out in the only respectable garment she owned, a plain black mourning dress made for a dead brother. In a season of feathers and diamonds and 14 changes of costume a week, a beautiful woman in unrelieved black was not overlooked. She was noticed at once, then talked about, then painted, by Millet, who was a fellow Jerseyman, who posed her holding a flower that was in fact a Guernsey lily, and called the picture a Jersey lily. It hung at the Royal Academy in 1878 and had to be roped off, because the crowds around it would not move on. What happened to her in those 2 years had never happened to anyone before. She became the original of a species, the period named, exactly, the professional beauty. Photographers gave her sittings free of charge because her image sold. The cartes de visite were stacked in shop windows and bought by clerks and housemaids who would never be in a room with her. Men stood on chairs in Hyde Park to watch her ride past. She was famous for being looked at. It is a modern kind of fame, and she was nearly the first in England to have it. And from the summer of 1877 until about the middle of 1880, she was the mistress of the heir to the British throne. What made it remarkable was not the fact of it, but that it was allowed, in a limited and carefully managed way, to be visible. He took her into company. He was seen with her. She was received in houses where she would otherwise never have been asked. A house was built for her at Bournemouth, and most of her biographers connect it to him. The newspapers of Britain understood the situation perfectly and printed nothing at all, and everybody who mattered knew, and the whole thing was conducted in a peculiar half-light, public and unpublishable at once. When it ended, she did not go under. She went on the stage, toured America, made a large fortune, bought race horses, and stayed on affectionate terms with him for the rest of his life. He is the rarest thing in this story, a woman who came out of it better than she went in. But she is also the way into the real subject, which is not any individual woman, it is the machinery. The English upper class of the late 19th century had built an elaborate and entirely unwritten system for managing adultery, and the country house weekend was the engine of it. A hostess who knew her business allocated bedrooms with the care of a diplomat drafting a treaty. Guests were placed along corridors, according to information nobody ever admitted to holding. In some houses, a gong was sounded early, well before the servants came through, so that everyone might be found where the plan of the house said they should be. The rules were rigid, and they were not primarily moral. A married woman was expected to give her husband an heir. First after that, within limits, her private life was regarded as her own affair. Husbands were expected to be complacent. Several were conspicuously rewarded for it in appointments and honors and invitations, and above all of it stood one absolute prohibition. Nothing could ever be admitted in public, because the penalty for admission was ruin, and it fell almost entirely on the women. A man in the divorce reports of the 1880 seconds was embarrassed. A woman in them was finished, cut by her friends, separated from her children, gone. The system was not a license, it was a cage with a comfortable interior, and the price of the comfort was silence. The Prince of Wales did not invent this world. He inherited it and did something more consequential. He made it fashionable. His presence at a house party was the highest honor English society could offer, and his taste set the terms of the whole enterprise. The shooting, the cards, the informality, the doors that were not watched. Men who wanted him under their roof learned what that required, and in the middle of it, entirely aware, sat his wife. Alexandra knew. There is very little doubt that she knew about most of them, and none at all that she knew about Mrs. Langtry, who was presented to her and received with perfect courtesy. She was famously kind to these women. She never complained in public. She never complained, so far as any record shows, to anybody outside her own family, and she made, somewhere in the first years of that marriage, a decision that she then kept for 47 years. She has often been written about as a victim, and the word is too small. The record suggests something harder and more interesting. a woman who worked out exactly what she was prepared to tolerate in order to keep her children, her position, her husband's real and lifelong affection, and her own dignity, and who then held the line without a single public tremor. She built a life inside it, her sons and daughters, her Danish family, her dogs, her hospitals, and her charities. And around all of it, year by year, the otosclerosis she had inherited from her mother closed in, until the woman most loved in England sat in rooms full of laughter and could no longer follow what was being said. It would be easy to leave him as nothing but an appetite. That would be unjust, and the corrective is a matter of record. In the autumn of 1875 he sailed for India, and for 8 months, the one substantial piece of public work his mother ever permitted him, he was, by common consent, magnificent. He was tireless. He was courteous to princes, whom British officials treated as furniture. And he was genuinely angry at what he found. He wrote home that because a man had a black face and a different religion from our own, there was no reason why he should be treated as a brute. Coming from a European prince in 1876, that is a remarkable sentence, and it was not merely a sentiment. Lord Salisbury, the India Office, issued new instructions as a result, and at least one official was removed from his post. He came home in the spring of 1876, having proved, in front of witnesses, that he could do the job, and he was returned to the shooting parties. So the pattern set hard, and through the 1,880 seconds it hardened further. The enormous appetite for pleasure, the careless, quite genuine kindness, the total absence of anything resembling employment. There were other women, the actress Sarah Bernhardt and Lady Randolph Churchill, the names most often reported, and reported is the correct word, because much of what is said about this part of his life is gossip and inference rather than evidence. The tabulated lists of his mistresses are inventions. What is not in doubt is that the circle of people who knew things about him was growing every year. For a decade the system held, because everyone inside it had the same interest in its holding. The husband stayed away from certain corridors. The newspapers printed nothing. The Princess of Wales smiled at the women in her drawing room and said not one word ever to anybody. It was a machine built entirely out of silence. And machines built out of silence have exactly one moving part that can fail. In the summer of 1889, the prince took up with the most beautiful and least discreet woman in England, a young countess-to-be whose friends had already nicknamed her the Babbling Brooke. She had, some years earlier, written a letter she should never have written, and a naval officer with a violent temper was about to read it. She was called Daisy, and from the moment she came out, she was one of the most conspicuous young women in England. Frances Evelyn Maynard was born in 1861 and inherited a fortune before she was old enough to know what to do with one, a great house at Easton Lodge in Essex, and money enough to place her among the largest heiresses of her generation. At 20, she married Lord Brooke, the heir to the Earl of Warwick, and in 1893 she became Countess of Warwick, mistress of a castle that had stood above the Avon since the Normans. She was beautiful in the full, unhurried style, the period admired, and clever in the restless, undisciplined way of a woman who has never once been obliged to be careful about anything. And she talked. Society noticed early and named her for it, with a phrase that was affectionate on the surface and a diagnosis underneath. They called her the Babbling Brooke. But in the world described in the last chapter, the corridors, the complacent husbands, the newspapers that knew everything and printed nothing, it was the most dangerous thing that could be said about a person. That world ran on one commodity, and the commodity was silence. Some years before the Prince of Wales came into her life, Daisy had conducted an affair with Lord Charles Beresford, Irish, celebrated, serving officer of the Royal Navy, with a gift for publicity, a real reputation for courage, and a temper his superiors had been managing for 20 years. It ended. as these things were meant to end without paperwork and without noise. And then Daisy learned that Lady Charles Beresford was expecting a child. What she did next cost her a decade. She sat down and wrote to Beresford a letter of undisguised, unedited jealousy. Precisely the kind of document the whole elaborate apparatus of her class existed to prevent from ever being committed to paper. Then she posted it. Beresford was at sea. The letter went to his house. His wife opened it. And, at that moment, the machine met the one thing for which it had no answer: a woman who had been wronged and did not feel like being quiet about it. Lady Charles Beresford did not burn the letter. She did not send it back. She did not do the thing the system required of her, which was to say nothing to anybody, ever. She took it to George Lewis. Lewis was the most formidable solicitor in London and the best informed man in England on the private conduct of its ruling class. The aristocracy brought him what could not be allowed to reach a courtroom, and the keeping of it had made him one of the quietly powerful men in the country. He was famously discreet, and this was the point, entirely unafraid of anybody. The moment Lady Charles walked into his office, gossip became something closer to a legal instrument. So Daisy went to the Prince of Wales. He was 47 that summer. She was 28. He took up her cause with the energy of a man who had spent 30 years being given nothing whatever to do. He called on George Lewis, by most accounts at night, which tells you how everyone involved understood the business, and asked that the letter be surrendered or destroyed. What passed between them in that room has never been reliably recorded. What is certain is that he did not get it. He also took Daisy as his mistress, an attachment that would last on and off for the better part of 9 years. And then he did the only thing available to a man in his position, which was nothing so vulgar as a threat. The Prince of Wales could not compel anyone in England to do anything. But he could decline to enter a room, and where the heir to the throne declined to go, the whole of society declined to go with him. Invitations to Lady Charles Beresford began to fail. Hostesses discovered difficulties. A woman whose entire offence had been to open her own post found the doors of the world she was born into closing against her one by one, and she understood perfectly well who was closing them. Her husband, meanwhile, was at sea and coming home. What happened when he arrived has been told a dozen ways and settled in none of them. The version most often repeated has Beresford confronting the heir to the throne at Marlborough House in a rage beyond anything the household had witnessed, and saying things to him that no subject had said to a Prince of Wales in living memory. It may well be true. No document proves it, and both families afterwards had excellent reasons to remember that afternoon differently. What is not in doubt is what he threatened. Beresford let it be understood that if the pressure on his wife did not stop, he would lay the prince's private life before the newspapers, the whole of it, names and dates in print. And Lady Charles's sister went further. She drafted a pamphlet setting the affair out in full, a document which, had it reached a printing press, would have done what nothing in that century had dared to do, and put the private conduct of the heir to the English throne before the reading public over his own name. Copies were said to have circulated privately, that is, as far as the evidence carries, and it was quite far enough. In the end, it went to the Prime Minister. Lord Salisbury had an empire to administer, a suspicious continent to watch, and an election coming, and he spent part of the winter of 1890 and the spring of 1891 negotiating over a private letter written by a young married woman to a naval officer about his wife's pregnancy. He got his settlement. In 1891, the Prince of Wales put his name to a written apology to Lady Charles Beresford. Beresford went back to his career and kept the grudge whole and undiminished for the rest of his life. But behind closed doors, the real damage was never the affair. The affair was ordinary. It was the shape of the thing that mattered. He had used the weight of his position to lean on a private family in a private quarrel. He had been threatened with public exposure by a serving officer holding the Queen's commission. And the whole squalid business had been settled only because the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom gave up his own time to settle it. For 30 years, Victoria had been saying that her son's character made him unfit to be trusted with anything of consequence. It was in almost every important sense an unjust verdict, and it had just been handed, a great deal of supporting evidence, assembled from first to last by the accused. As for Daisy, her story went somewhere nobody who knew her in 1891 could have predicted. She spent the 90s as the most extravagant hostess in England. Then, still in her 30s, she read an attack on one of her own parties in a socialist newspaper, and was angry enough to confront the editor in person by her own account. She lost the argument. She walked out of that office a different woman. She joined the Social Democratic Federation, campaigned for the labor movement and for the education of working-class children, gave away a great deal of what she had, and spent the rest of her life. She died in 1938, arguing that the world which had produced her had no right to exist. Of everyone in this story, she alone looked at that society from the inside and concluded that it was indefensible. All of that, though, was still ahead of her. It had been contained. The Prime Minister had smoothed it over, the pamphlet was never printed, and the newspapers of Britain, still, that year, a press that would not print what it knew about the throne, let it go. The Prince of Wales had come within an inch of ruin over a letter he had not written about an affair that was not his, and had escaped by the width of a signature on an apology. He should by any reasonable measure have learned something. Instead, in September of 1890, he accepted an invitation to a house party in Yorkshire and packed, as he always did when he travelled, his own set of leather-cased counters for baccarat, a game which was at that time entirely illegal in England. The house was called Tranby Croft, and it stood a few miles outside Hull, in the East Riding of Yorkshire. Large, comfortable, and unmistakably modern, the property of a man named Arthur Wilson, who owned ships. The Wilson fortune had been made in a single generation out of iron hulls and the northern trade, and the family knew exactly what the older houses thought of money like that. In September of 1890, during Doncaster Race Week, they achieved the thing such a fortune was, for the Prince of Wales came to stay. He arrived, as he always arrived, a valet, an equerry, a mountain of luggage, and somewhere in it a leather case of counters for baccarat marked with his own 3 feathers. Baccarat was at that date illegal in Britain. Everyone knew it. Nobody gave it a moment's thought. The gaming laws at that table were understood to have been written for other people entirely. Among the guests was Sir William Gordon Cumming. He was 42 years old, a baronet, a Highland landowner, a lieutenant colonel of the Scots Guards decorated on active service, and a friend of the Prince of long standing. He was also, by nearly every account that survives, a man of remarkable personal coldness, arrogant, cutting, and disliked by a great many of the people who knew him best. That last fact would end up mattering more than any of the others. They played on the night of the 8th of September. The Prince took the bank as he generally did, using his own counters. The players ranged along a table, improvised out of 3 smaller ones and a cloth. And at some point in the evening the son of the house, Stanley Wilson, sitting near enough to see, believed that he saw Gordon Cumming push additional counters onto his stake after the coup had been declared and won. He said so quietly, to somebody else. That somebody told another. By the following evening, it had spread through half the party like a slow fire. They played again on the 9th. This time 5 people were watching, knowing exactly what to watch for. And afterwards, all 5 said they had seen it. What the house did next is the hinge of the whole affair. One consideration in that room outranked every other. The heir to the throne was present at an illegal game played with his own counters under a roof whose owner had spent a lifetime climbing towards this weekend. A scandal was unthinkable, so they improvised. Gordon Cumming was confronted privately. He denied it, absolutely and furiously, and went on denying it. And he was then handed a piece of paper, an undertaking that, in exchange for the permanent silence of everyone present, he would never play cards again as long as he lived. He signed it. He maintained for the rest of his life that he had signed only to keep the prince's name out of a scandal. 10 people signed that document. Among the signatures at the foot of the page was that of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. It is worth pausing on what he had signed, because the newspapers of England shortly would. He was a soldier himself, and the regulations were not ambiguous about what an officer did when a brother officer stood accused of cheating at cards. He reported it. The Prince of Wales signed a private paper instead and went to the races. Leaked, of course. It always leaks. Within weeks the story was moving through the clubs of London and out into the drawing rooms, and Gordon Cumming discovered that his life had ended without anyone saying a word to his face. He was in the only sense that counted to a man like him, finished. He demanded a retraction from his accusers. None came. And on the 6th of February 1891, he issued writs for slander against 5 of them, claiming £5,000 from each. The trial opened on the 1st of June 1891 at the Royal Courts of Justice, before the Lord Chief Justice of England, Lord Coleridge. Admission was by ticket. Fashionable London queued for them as though for a first night, and sat in summer clothes in the gallery to watch what the press had already christened the Royal Baccarat scandal. The Prince of Wales was subpoenaed. That word is the whole of the difference. 21 years earlier, he had walked into a divorce court and answered questions for 7 minutes, because it suited everybody that he should. This time he was not asked, and he was not accommodated. He was compelled, served like any other witness. By the reckoning of the lawyers who went looking for a precedent at the time, no heir to the English throne had been compelled by subpoena to attend a court of law since 1411. So he came. And he sat day after day in a chair placed beside the bench, while counsel took apart an unlawful card game played in his presence, with his counters in a private house, and every syllable was printed by every newspaper in the kingdom. He gave his evidence. He was not seriously pressed. It made no difference whatever. What the country saw was a future King of England attending a slander trial about a game of cards for the better part of a week by order of a court. Then Sir Edward Clarke rose for Gordon Cumming. Clarke was at that moment the Solicitor General of England, and his closing speech was remembered by people who heard it for the rest of their lives. He did not accuse the Prince of anything. He did not need to. He simply invited 12 jurors to consider how convenient it would have been for a room full of people who had allowed an unlawful game to be played in front of the heir to the throne, if the whole business could be made to belong to one man, and to a man nobody much liked. The Lord Chief Justice summed up against him. The jury withdrew, was gone a matter of minutes, and found against Gordon Cumming. The public gallery hissed the verdict. The next day he was dismissed from the army. Within days he married an American heiress. Then he went north to Morayshire, lived there for the rest of his life, and was never received in London society again. He never withdrew a word of his denial. That he cheated has never been settled, and it is difficult to see how it now could be. A long and respectable tradition holds that he was sacrificed, that the case against him rested on what 5 people believed they had seen across a lamplit table at a fast game with counters in a crowded room, and that 4 of those 5 were watching on the second night only because they had already been told what to look for. Against that stands the plain fact that 5 people did say it, and that he signed the paper rather than face them. Historians still argue over it to this day. What can fairly be said is that the evidence would not now be thought overwhelming, and that the man it destroyed was one very few people had reason to defend, and the Prince of Wales was flayed. The Times lectured him on the example a future sovereign owed the country he would one day govern. From Berlin, his own nephew, the German emperor, 32 years old and 3 years on his throne, wrote to complain that a man holding the honorary colonelcy of a Prussian hussar regiment ought not to be gambling with young officers. It was the first of a great many such letters. At Ascot that summer he was hissed on his own racecourse. Alexandra was abroad for much of it and said in public exactly what she had always said about her husband's private life, which was nothing whatever. In every practical sense it was the worst month he ever lived through. He was 49 years old. He had spent 30 years being told he was unfit to be trusted with the affairs of state, and he had just spent a week in the royal courts of justice, proving to the satisfaction of every newspaper in the kingdom that his mother might have had a point. Punch drew him with 3 feathers turned into 3. Playing cards. The bishops preached about him. And at Windsor, an old woman in black read the reports and felt nothing that could be called surprise. It seemed impossible that the year could grow any worse for him. Then, 6 months later, in the coldest January anyone could remember, influenza came to Sandringham and took his eldest son. The influenza that came out of the East in 1889 and went round the world 3 times before it was finished, reached Norfolk in the first week of January 1892. Half of England was coughing that winter, and the newspapers carried the death notices in columns that grew a little longer every week. At Sandringham it settled on the Prince of Wales's eldest son. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Eddie to everybody who knew him, was a few days short of 28, and he was the standing, unspoken anxiety of his family. He was gentle, affectionate, and easy company. He was also languid, nearly to the point of torpor, hard of hearing, like his mother, and, in the judgment of very nearly everyone, obliged to form one unequal to what was coming to him. They had tried him at sea, at Cambridge, in India, and in the cavalry, much as his father had once been sent to a camp in Ireland, in the hope that one of the experiments might take. None had. In December of 1891, he was engaged to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, a serious and dutiful young woman chosen very largely because she was serious and dutiful. It was, almost exactly, the remedy that had been prescribed for his father 30 years before. He fell ill in the first days of the new year. His 28th birthday was kept in a sick room. The influenza turned to pneumonia, and pneumonia, at winter, was very often the end of the story. On the 14th of January 1892, with his parents and his fiancée in the house, he died. A considerable literature has attached itself to his name since: secret marriages, hidden vices, even a part in the Whitechapel murders. No evidence for any of it was ever produced. What is documented is smaller and sadder: an amiable, half-deaf young man, born into a position he was not built to occupy. What followed was the worst grief of his father's life. Alexandra, by several accounts, had her son's rooms kept afterwards much as he had left them. The same instinct the country had spent 30 years mocking in The Widow at Windsor, and nobody found it absurd now. Edward wrote that to lose their eldest son was a calamity one could never really get over. And to his mother he wrote a sentence that deserves reading twice, that he would gladly have given his own life for the boys, because he put no value upon his own. He was 50 years old, and that was his honest estimate of what his life was worth. The succession moved to the second son, who was a different article altogether. Prince George had been at sea since he was 12, and the Navy had made him punctual, orderly, unimaginative, and thoroughly reliable. In 1893, he married his dead brother's fiancée, an arrangement that sounds macabre at this distance, and was, by every indication, a contented one. And here one plain good thing must be recorded, in a story that contains very few. Bertie, raised by a father he could never satisfy, and a mother who could not look at him without a shudder, was to his own children an affectionate parent, and never for a moment a figure they were frightened of. Whatever else the machine of his upbringing had manufactured, it had manufactured a man determined never to build another one. In that same year, 1892, the government at last prevailed upon the Queen to let her heir see some cabinet papers. That sentence is worth stopping on, because it is his whole life in a line. He was 50, and he had been Prince of Wales since he was 1 month old. For 4 decades, his own country's government had reached him second-hand in digests and summaries, like the review of a play he was not permitted to attend, and the key to the boxes that carried the originals had been refused him every time he asked. Now he was allowed a portion of it. It was not a promotion. It was an admission made, very late and very quietly, that the arrangement had become ridiculous. In 1898, he met the last and most important of the women in this story. Mrs. George Keppel was 29. He was 56. She was married to an obliging army officer who accepted the situation without complaint, and she was unlike anyone before her, witty rather than merely beautiful, politically shrewd, and able to tell him when he was being absurd and be forgiven within the minute. She managed the temper that by then frightened grown statesmen, and after 1901 became something close to an unofficial channel between the king and his ministers. In a long life afterwards, through 2 reigns and 2 wars, Alice Keppel never once said anything about him in public. Meanwhile, the century was ending badly. In October of 1899, Britain went to war with the 2 Boer republics of southern Africa, expecting to be finished by Christmas, lost 3 battles in a single black week, and then settled into 2.5 years of blockhouses and farm burning. Continental feeling ran violently against the British. And through all of it, the heir to the throne went on, travelling exactly as he always had, the most visible Englishman alive, in open carriages, entirely unguarded by the standards of any later age. On the 4th of April 1900, some accounts give the 5th. Royal trains stood at the Brussels North Station with the Prince and Princess of Wales aboard, on their way to Copenhagen. A 15-year-old apprentice named Jean-Baptiste Sipideau, who appears to have concluded that the war in South Africa was the personal work of the Prince of Wales, stepped up onto the footboard of the carriage, put a revolver through the open window, and fired twice at a range of a few feet. He hit nobody. Neither the prince nor the princess was touched. Sipideau was seized on the platform and afterwards acquitted on the grounds of his youth, a verdict that produced a real diplomatic quarrel between London and Brussels. He lived until 1959. In the newspapers, it was a 2-day sensation. Boy on a footboard, a foreign station, 2 wild shots at an English prince over a war 10,000 miles away. 14 years later, another young man would step up to another royal carriage in another European city, and the world both of them lived in would end. And then, at last, the waiting ended. The Queen was 81, and her reign had gone on so long that the great majority of her subjects had been born into it and could not imagine its ending. Her sight was almost gone. The Boer War had aged her hard, and the deaths of a son and a grandson within a few months of each other, in 1900, took something out of her that did not come back. She went to Osborne, the house Albert had built for her on the Isle of Wight, for Christmas, and did not recover. At 6:30 in the evening, on the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died there, and the 59 years and 45 days of her eldest son's apprenticeship ended in the same minute. Her family were in the room, and among them, supporting her from one side, was her grandson, the German Emperor, who had crossed the sea uninvited and stayed to the end. Accounts of that room differ in their details, as accounts of such rooms always do. The version that has come down to us has her dying in the arms of the son she had never been able to forgive. The Queen was dead. There had not been a king in England since 1837, and most of the population had never in their lives had occasion to use the word. He had waited longer for a throne than any heir in the history of England, and he took it in a country that had already decided what he was. He was 59. He was overweight, short of breath, and famous in every capital in Europe as a gambler, a diner-out, and a co-respondent. The Times, in its notice of his accession, went so far as to express the hope that he would rise above the temptations of his past. Ministers braced themselves. Diplomats made private jokes. And on the 23rd of January, at St. James's Palace, the new king rose in front of the assembled Privy Council of the United Kingdom, without notes, without a written text, without any of the training his mother had spent 40 years denying him, and began to speak. They had assembled in the morning at St. James's Palace, the great officers of state, the archbishops, the ministers, the privy councillors, a room of men who, between them, administered a quarter of the surface of the earth. A good many of them had spent 30 years telling one another, in clubs and in country houses and in the margins of official memoranda, that the man now walking to the head of the room was not equal to the position he was about to assume. He had no prepared text. He spoke for a few minutes, and one part of what he said has been remembered ever since. He would, he told them, be known by the name of Edward. A name, he said, which had been borne by 6 of his ancestors. He added that he did not by this wish to undervalue the name of Albert, but that name, he said, should stand alone. It was on its face an act of filial modesty, and it was received as one. It was also the single most deliberate sentence of his life. His mother had wanted him to reign under his father's name, so that Albert should be carried down the line of English kings forever, a perpetual memorial written into the succession itself. He had been Albert Edward for 59 years, and had never been permitted to be anything else. Now, less than a day after her death, in the first minutes of his reign, in front of the entire governing class of the United Kingdom, he had declined. Courteously, unanswerably, and with a reason nobody could argue against, to be his father. Those present appear to have been surprised by the performance, which tells you a good deal about what they had come expecting. What happened next was, to some who witnessed it, close to violent. The shrines came down. For 40 years the royal houses had been museums of a dead man, his rooms preserved, his clothes laid out, his shaving water brought each morning, half a century of relics gathering the particular dust of things nobody is allowed to touch. The new king went through them like a man clearing a house after a funeral, which is precisely what he was. Osborne, where his mother had died, he did not want at all. He gave it to the nation. At Windsor and at Buckingham Palace, the clutter of the morning years went into store, and the palace itself, shut, dark, and largely unused since 1861, was reopened, rewired, redecorated, and filled with people. He put the monarchy back out into the daylight. The levees, the courts, and the drawing-rooms were revived. He rode in open carriages. And in 1901 he restored the state opening of Parliament as a full ceremonial occasion, driving to Westminster in state and reading the speech from the throne aloud himself, something his mother had not done in decades, and which a whole generation of members had never seen a sovereign do at all. The coronation was fixed for the 26th of June 1902. Half the royalty of Europe was already in London. The streets were dressed, the stands were built, the coronation banquet was waiting in the Buckingham Palace kitchens. 2 days before the date, his doctors found an abscess in his abdomen. It was appendicitis, at a period when abdominal surgery was still substantially experimental and very frequently fatal, and when a great many surgeons preferred to wait and hope rather than open a patient at all. He refused at first. The coronation would go ahead, he insisted. He would go to the Abbey, whatever it cost him. Sir Frederick Treves, who has left the fullest account of the argument, is reported to have answered that in that case he would go to the Abbey. As a corpse. The king gave way. They operated in a room at Buckingham Palace, on a table brought in for the purpose, with Lord Lister, the man who had given surgery, and T. Sepsis in attendance. Treves did not remove the appendix. He drained the abscess through a small incision and left it, which was the cautious course, and almost certainly the correct one. The coronation was postponed by proclamation. The crowned heads of Europe went home, and the food prepared for the banquet was sent down to the poor of the East End, who ate the king's coronation dinner while the king lay upstairs under morphine. By the next morning, according to those around him, he was sitting up in bed, smoking a cigar. He recovered with a speed that astonished everybody, and the operation had a consequence nobody had planned. Appendicectomy. Until that summer, a procedure of last resort, argued over in the medical journals, became overnight the thing that had saved the King of England. Surgeons who had hesitated stopped hesitating. Patients who would have refused consented. The lives that followed from it cannot be counted, but the number is very large, and it remains the most useful thing Edward VII ever did while unconscious. He was crowned on the 9th of August 1902 in Westminster Abbey, in a service cut down to accommodate a convalescent king and an Archbishop of Canterbury who was 80 years old, nearly blind, and so frail that he had to be helped back to his feet after the anointing. Frederick Temple was dead within months. Alexandra was crowned beside her husband, and the newspapers, which had spent 30 years not printing what they knew, printed nothing then either, although society, with the precision it reserved for such matters, is said to have noticed a particular gallery box filled with ladies of the king's acquaintance, and to have christened it, i.e., or in the language of the stable yard, the king's loose box. The story is contemporary gossip rather than record, and it has never quite gone away. And then, to the astonishment of very nearly everyone in public life, he turned out to be good at the job. He was punctual to the minute and furious with people who were not. He was ferociously exact about protocol, uniform, decoration, and precedence. A pedantry that looked ridiculous until you noticed that ceremony was the only instrument a constitutional monarch actually held. He backed Admiral Fisher's ruthless modernization of the Navy, and after the humiliations of South Africa, the reconstruction of the army. In 1902 he founded the Order of Merit, an honor limited in number and given for achievement rather than for birth, rank, or party service. He grasped something his mother had never had any interest in grasping, that the power of a modern monarchy was not the power to decide, which had gone, but the power to be seen, which had not. And there was the detail. That ought to stand as the last word on 40 years of his mother's judgment. The red dispatch boxes, the boxes whose key he had asked for at 25 and at 35 and at 45 and been refused every time. Boxes whose contents had been withheld from him for so long that ministers had stopped finding it strange, came to his desk every day of his reign. And every day of his reign he read them. He read them at Sandringham and at Windsor, at Biarritz, and on the deck of the royal yacht. He annotated them, argued with them, and complained sharply when they arrived late or arrived incomplete. Officials who had braced themselves for an idle king found instead an exacting one who noticed when a paper was missing and wanted to know why. He had waited 40 years to be given the work. When it finally came, he did not put it down. There remained one absolute limit, and he understood it perfectly well. He could not decide anything. He could not make policy, appoint a ministry against the Commons, or commit his country to a single line of a treaty. What a King of England could still do in a Europe governed by his own relations was go somewhere in person. And in the spring of 1903, he informed a startled Foreign Office that he intended to pay a state visit to Paris. His ministers thought the Paris visit was at best an eccentricity, and at worst a humiliation waiting to happen. France and Britain had come within a few weeks of war over a mud fort on the Upper Nile only 5 years earlier. The French press had spent the Boer War calling the English murderers, and had printed cartoons of his mother that no Englishman could read without anger. He went anyway. He went almost alone, on his own initiative, against advice. And when the royal carriage rolled out of the Bois de Boulogne on the 1st of May 1903, the crowds lining the Champs-Élysées began, exactly as the Foreign Office had feared, to shout. What they shouted was, "Vive Fashoda!" and "Vive les Boers!" and a number of other things along the route that the official account of the visit preferred not to preserve. Nothing had been forgotten, not the mud fort on the Upper Nile, not the years in which the French press had described the English in terms no Englishman could read without anger. And now the King of England was riding up the Champs-Élysées in an open carriage in the May sunshine of 1903, while a great city told him, cheerfully and at volume, exactly what it thought of his country. He is said to have turned to a member of his suite and observed mildly that the French did not appear to like him very much. He had 4 days. What he did with them has been studied by diplomatic historians ever since, and there was no plan in it whatever. No strategy. No line from the Foreign Office. There was only a man of 61 who had spent 40 years in the drawing rooms of Europe learning how to make a room warm to him, and who now applied that skill, at full stretch, to an entire capital. At the Théâtre Français, on the first evening, he did the thing everybody afterwards remembered. In the interval he walked out into the foyer in front of the whole assembled audience, and crossed it to greet a French actress whose performances he had admired in London years before. What he said to her has come down in several versions, each more graceful than the last, and it hardly matters. The point was that he had crossed the room. It was in every paper in Paris by the morning. At the Hôtel de Ville, where the reception was expected to be coldest, he stood and spoke in French, fluent, idiomatic, read from nothing, about 2 nations whose civilizations were older than their quarrels. He was not performing. He had loved the city since he was 19, and everybody in the room could tell. He reviewed the troops, he went to the races, he was courteous to every person put in front of him, and in the way that had baffled his father half a century earlier, he remembered afterwards who each of them was. By the 4th day, the shouting along the route had changed. It had become "Vive notre roi," long live our king, which is not a thing crowds say about a foreign monarch, and which no ambassador on earth could have arranged. 11 months later, on the 8th of April 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, settling at a stroke the colonial quarrels of a century. Egypt, Morocco, Newfoundland, Siam, West Africa, and turning the 2 oldest enemies in Europe into something that was not quite an alliance and was very much more than a truce. And here the story has to be told carefully, because the popular version of it is wrong. Edward VII did not negotiate the Entente Cordiale. He did not draft it, he was not consulted on its clauses as they were argued over, and he did not conceive it. That work was done by his Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne and by the French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse, and it had been underway, quietly, professionally, with all the ordinary friction of 2 colonial empires trying to put a price on a century of grievance before the king ever set foot in Paris. The agreement was not his achievement, and every serious historian of the period has taken some trouble to say so. What was his was the weather. Governments may sign whatever they please. What they cannot manufacture is a public willing to be signed for. In the spring of 1903, the 2 peoples disliked one another, and by the summer they did not, and that change was substantially his doing. He did not build the thing, he made it possible to build. Those are different contributions, and the difference matters, but the legend of Edward the Architect grew up almost at once in his own lifetime and within his own hearing, and he did remarkably little to discourage it. He could do what he did because of who he was, in a sense that has almost no modern equivalent. He was quite literally the uncle of Europe. The German emperor was his nephew, his sister Vicky's eldest son. The Empress of Russia was his niece, which made the Tsar his nephew by marriage twice over, in fact, since Nicholas's mother was Alexandra's own sister. The Queen of Spain was his niece. The King of Norway was his son-in-law and his nephew both. The kings of Denmark and of the Hellenes were his brothers-in-law, and nieces of his were crown princesses in Romania, in Greece, and in Sweden. When he sat down to dinner in a European capital, he was very often the senior member of the family at the table, and he travelled, constantly, with an appetite that exhausted men 20 years younger. Marienbad. Every August, for the waters. Biarritz, every spring. Copenhagen, Kiel, Rome, Lisbon, Vienna, Berlin. Half of it looked like a rich man's holiday, and half of it was. But he talked to everybody, listened to a great deal more than he said, and wrote home about it. And Whitehall, which had begun by regarding these journeys as an indulgence, came round to regarding them as an instrument. In June of 1908, he took the royal yacht into the bay off Reval, met the Tsar of Russia there, the first reigning British sovereign ever to visit the Russian Empire. The Anglo-Russian Convention had been signed the year before. The meeting set a seal upon it. There is an irony in that harbour worth pausing over. The last structural piece of the alliance system that would carry Europe into the catastrophe of 1914 was set in place in the presence of a man who had not been permitted to read a cabinet paper until he was 50 years old. And through all of it, at the edge of every photograph, there was his nephew. The antagonism between Edward VII and Wilhelm II was one of the great personal antipathies of the age, and it was never really about policy. The Kaiser, theatrical, brittle, fixated on the English family that had produced him and convinced, on very little evidence, that they were laughing at him, wanted his uncle's approval and could not bring himself to ask for it. The king found him exhausting and faintly ridiculous. Out of that entirely domestic ill-feeling grew a fixed German conviction that the heavy old man in the yachting cap was personally and deliberately weaving a net of encirclement around Germany, binding France to Russia and Russia to Britain with his own two hands. It was a wild overestimate of what any one monarch could do. It was also, in a way, nobody in Berlin intended, a compliment. He was better than his reputation in other ways. At Kiel, 1904, arguing with that same nephew about the Japanese, he defended them as an intelligent, brave and chivalrous nation, quite as civilized as the Europeans. The same instinct that had made him write home from India 30 years earlier about men treated as brutes for the color of their faces. He was not a liberal, and he was certainly not a thinker. He simply could never be brought to believe that people were worth less for being foreign, and it was quite visibly killing him. He had smoked since boyhood, the cigars, the cigarettes, decade upon decade of them, and by his middle 60s, the account was being presented. He suffered bronchial attacks that left him grey and badly frightened the men around him. In Berlin, in February of 1909, buttoned into the tight uniform of a Prussian regiment at a state dinner, he lost consciousness at the table and had to be helped from the room. And the German court did what courts do, and said nothing at all. He had spent his reign doing the only thing his mother had ever left him free to do, meeting people, and had discovered at 62 that in a Europe of monarchs it happened to be the most useful thing a king could possibly do. For 7 years the trick worked, and then, in the winter of 1909, the quarrel came home. The House of Lords threw out a budget which it had not done since the 17th century, and the government of the United Kingdom came to its king with a request he could not grant and could not refuse, that he agree in advance and in secret to create 500 new peers and break the Lords forever. It was the gravest constitutional crisis in living memory. He was 68 years old, and he could no longer walk up a flight of stairs without stopping. The budget that broke the Constitution had been introduced in the spring of 1909 by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, and it proposed to pay for old age pensions and for dreadnoughts by taxing land and taxing the rich. The Commons passed it. In November, the House of Lords, overwhelmingly Conservative and overwhelmingly landed, threw it out. A thing no upper house had done to a finance bill in 2.5 centuries, and a deliberate breaking of the oldest unwritten rule in British politics. Asquith went to the country in January of 1910 and came back weaker than he had gone, propped up by the Irish nationalists and in no position to be gracious. And so the request arrived at Buckingham Palace. Would the king undertake, privately, in advance, and in secret, to create as many new peers as it might take to swamp the House of Lords if the Commons should demand it? He was appalled, and he was right to be. He was not being asked to decide anything. He was being asked to be used. A sovereign who gave that promise became an instrument of one party against another for the first time in generations, and a sovereign who refused it set himself against the elected house. There was no version of the thing in which the crown came out unstained, so he did what tired men do with impossible questions. He temporized. He asked for another election first and tried, privately and without success, to broker a compromise between men who had no interest in one. And presenting his son to his friend Lord Haldane around this time, he is reported to have remarked, half in joke and not in joke at all, that here was the last King of England. He went to Biarritz in March, as he did every spring, and collapsed there with bronchitis. He stayed on to recover and was attacked in the London papers for idling at a French resort while the constitution of his country hung in the balance. The papers did not know how ill he was, and he was not a man who explained himself. He came back to Buckingham Palace on the 27th of April, visibly unwell, and went straight back to the boxes he had waited 40 years to be given, and to the audiences, and to the opera. Alexandra was in Corfu, staying with her brother, the King of the Hellenes. She was sent for, and reached London on the 5th of May. On the 6th, he suffered a series of heart attacks through the course of the day, and every time they came for him, he refused to go to bed. He was dressed, he received people, he was told repeatedly to stop. "No," he said. "I shall not give in. I shall go on. I shall work to the end." And at some point during that day, Alexandra, 65 years old, almost entirely deaf, and married to him for 47 years, sent for Alice Keppel and brought her into the room to say goodbye to him. That much is not in doubt, and it remains one of the most extraordinary acts of any royal wife in the modern history of the monarchy. What happened next is contested. The affecting version, the Queen taking her husband's mistress by the hand, weeping with her, promising that the family would look after her, comes very largely from Mrs. Keppel's own account, given long afterwards. Other testimony from the household is harsher, that she lost her composure, that the scene became unbearable, and that she was escorted from the room, which Keppel herself later conceded. Both stories cannot be true. But they agree on the fact that matters, which is that Alexandra let her come. In the evening his son George told him that his horse, which of the heir, had won that afternoon at Kempton Park. "Yes," said the king, "I have heard of it. I'm very glad." They were the last words of his that anybody wrote down. He lost consciousness at 11:30 and died a quarter of an hour later, on the 6th of May 1910, at the age of 68. Alexandra told Frederick Ponsonby afterwards, "I feel as if I had been turned into stone, unable to cry, unable to grasp the meaning of it all. She would not let them move him." For 8 days the body of the King of England lay where it was, in the room where he had died, while his widow sat with it. Then they took him to Westminster Hall, and the country came. For 3 days in the middle of May, a queue stood in the streets of London, in the rain and out of it. Some 500,000 people filed past the coffin, clerks and dockers and women with children, the ordinary population of a city that had been told for 40 years that this man was a wastrel, and had never once, in the end. When the doors finally closed, Big Ben tolled 68 times. once for each year of his life. It had never been done for a monarch before. The procession moved on the morning of the 20th of May, 1910, through streets packed with millions. Behind the gun carriage came the new king, George V, and riding with him in a body, 8 more reigning sovereigns: the German Emperor, Wilhelm II, Alfonso XIII of Spain, George I of the Hellenes, Albert I of the Belgians, Haakon VII of Norway, Frederick VIII of Denmark, Manuel II of Portugal, and Ferdinand of Bulgaria. 9 kings in one column, on one morning. Theodore Roosevelt came to represent the United States. The Tsar did not come, and sent his brother in his place. And ahead of the crowned heads of Europe, on a lead held by a Highland servant, walked a small white fox terrier called Caesar, whose collar read, "I am Caesar. I belong to the king." It was said afterwards that the Kaiser did not care for the arrangement. Half a century later, Barbara Tuteman began the Guns of August with that procession and observed that nothing like it had ever been gathered in one place before, and that nothing like it would be gathered again of its kind the last. Somewhere, further back in that column, among the heirs and princes who did not rate a paragraph in the newspapers, rode the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. 4 years and 2 months after the horses went down Whitehall, Europe went to war with itself. Manuel of Portugal had already lost his throne by the October following the funeral. George of the Hellenes was shot dead at Salonika in 1913. Wilhelm and Ferdinand were both gone by the end of 1918, one into exile in a Dutch country house, and the other into exile in Germany, and the nephew by marriage who had stayed away, Nicholas, the last Tsar, would end in a cellar with his wife, who was Edward's niece, and their children. Of the men who rode through London that morning in their plumes and their mourning bands, a good number were riding at the funeral of their own world and did not know it. He had been the last man alive who could speak to every one of them as family, and he had been dead for 4 years when they needed him. Alexandra outlived him by 15 years, going slowly, deafer and more solitary, and died at Sandringham in November of 1925. He was not a great man, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. He was greedy and self-indulgent, and occasionally petty. He was capable of using his position to lean on people who could not lean back, and the bills for his pleasures were paid over and over again by women who had no standing to refuse them and no way of answering afterwards. Nellie Clifton died young and poor. Harriet Mordaunt died in an asylum after 36 years of confinement. He walked away from both, because that is what men in his position did, and the country he would one day rule agreed to look elsewhere. And yet for 9 years he was an unexpectedly good king. Courteous, punctual, tireless, genuinely modern, a man who read his papers every day of his reign and understood, as his mother never had, that a monarchy which cannot be seen cannot survive. He had exactly one gift, and it was this: people liked him and told him things. It was the gift his father had tried for 11 years to educate out of him as frivolity. It was the gift his mother had refused for 40 years to find any use for at all. They buried him at Windsor in St. George's Chapel, a few dozen paces from the vault where his father had been laid in the winter of 1861, and from the mausoleum at Frogmore, where his mother lay beside her Albert at last. 3 graves, 1 family, 1 quarrel that had lasted half a century and had never once been settled. History remembers Prince Albert as the good man and Queen Victoria as the great queen, and it remembers Bertie, when it remembers him at all, as the fat one in the middle who liked cards. But there is a photograph taken in the grounds of Windsor Castle on the 20th of May, 1910. 9 kings, in one room, in their mourning coats, looking into the lens. 4 years and 2 months later, most of the world they ruled would be gone forever. He was the last man who could have got all of them into that room. And his mother spent 40 years making absolutely certain he would never be permitted to do anything else.